did Gary preach on last week? So remember, we're just taking a little bit of a break for Easter, and then we're going to kick back into Revelation series, so don't worry. We get in there. We won't not finish it, but this stuff is cool as well. So looking back last week, Gary kind of said, the world is in better shape than it's ever been before, and yet humanity seems to be kind of really struggling with mental illnesses increasing. Happiness seems to be on the down low, and the family unit seems to be breaking down. And he kind of unpacked all of that. If you want to know more about that, then you just go to our YouTube whatnot thingamajig. All right, today, I'm kind of setting up for Gary for next week. And I went down some rabbit holes. I know, shocking. Like what? Why would I do that? I have to tell you, so I keep a wish list of books. Like I have Kindle and I buy books on there, but I want real books, right? So I have a wish list, but my wish list is quite unique in that, A, they're normally quite expensive because they tend to be a little bit more, I suppose, academic or scholarly, and then the guys charge more because, hello. So then I have this wish list, and then every now and then via Faith Without Hints, I send a link to Gary on WhatsApp, like, oh, look at this book's on special. And then, amazingly, he orders them for me, because, again, Faith Without Hints, and then I have to wait, because books take time to get into this country, apparently, longer than shoes or clothing. So I kind of forget about the fact that I've found these books and they're coming. Anyway, so I had a whole stash of books. It was probably in January, I think. Where's Jen? I can't remember. I can't remember. January, February. I'd forgotten about these books that Gary had ordered for me. And they arrived. I was excited. I know you guys are looking at me like I'm strange, but imagine if it was shoes or clothes or something. That was the excitement. And I got this one book called In the Shadow of the Temple. It's a nice, thick, juicy, it's very dense. It's taken me a while to get through. I haven't finished it. And it talks about kind of what was happening around the origins, like in the world in terms of the origins of Christianity. What was going on in the world that kind of led to certain things. So some of that you're going to get today. And what we understood was that from the time of Alexander the Great, the world changed quite radically, or started to change. And one of the things that had changed was how they defined themselves. So before Alexander the Great and all his conquests, people used to define themselves by their origin of kind of where they were born. So if you were born in whatever territory, if you were born as a Persian or as an Egyptian or whatever, you were born in Egypt, that is who you were. That is kind of how it worked. Have I got the wrong slide up here? No? All right. I'm going ahead of myself. So that's how identity was looked at. It was where you were born, and that's who you were. It was pretty simple. And either you were a Jew, an Egyptian, a Persian, an Eastern, or whatever they would call you, or you weren't. And if you weren't, then you were a foreigner. And there was very little kind of, I think, intermingling of people kind of traveling around. But however, after Alexander the Great, things changed quite a bit. So there was a new way of defining identity. And this came through the very Greek influence that started to come through. So people started to talk, even though they were Jewish or they were Egyptian or they were whatever, they started to talk Greek. They started to walk, dress like Greeks. And things kind of changed. You see a little bit of this today where people have moved country and whatever. Origin and identity started to shift in a big way. The older cultures, like your Persian cultures, your Egyptians, your Judaisms, all those kind of old religious cultures that were there were no longer held in high esteem. Remember that Alexander the Great conquered. He went throughout the world and he conquered other cultures, let's say. He went in and overtook with armies and things like that. So these people became the conquered peoples. And now they started to be seen as inferior, which must have been quite a thing. So, and then over time, because Greek is pretty much what we would consider English today in terms of how the impact became, everybody started to talk Greek. Everybody, if you were Jewish, you could speak maybe Hebrew, but then you would also know and be able to speak Greek as well. It was the international language. It became the language of business. It became the language of administration and government and so on and so forth. Koine Greek, which is your kind of local language that kind of absorbed all the dialects and kind of merged into this Koine Greek, and that was used as a means of communication. So you see in the New Testament, they wrote most of it in Greek. You have the Hebrew Bible, which was translated into what they call the Septuagint, that was into Greek, written by Hebrew people, but written in Greek. And then their literature, the Greek literature, was supreme. It was known as, but they used it, and we can see through the book of Revelation, they used it as a means, a very good means of literature. It was pretty supreme in how they used it. Right. So the Greek culture, the Roman culture, it's kind of the same thing, was considered the culture of the new era. And every other culture had to kind of adopt it in order to belong. Because they were known as conquerors, there was armies, it was the new business elite. It's a very dominating kind of culture that kind of forced its way into other cultures. And the Greeks were very proud that they had created something new. They were very proud about that. However, secretly, they admired the older religions. They knew that this new culture didn't have the history attached to like what the Egyptians had and what the Hebrews had. They didn't have that history of origin. Plato had a deep admiration for the ancient or Oriental wisdom. They admired their traditions, the cults, the religion that came through. And they admired and understood that the divine kinship that these kingdoms had was something that they needed, because they recognized that their new era of culture couldn't fulfill two roles, and those two roles were the role of religion in a world empire, because that's how the world was run, was through religion in terms of cities, and it was through your religious beliefs and traditions. And the democratic system, this is interesting, couldn't work effectively because it was based on conquered people. That's interesting. You can't give people who you've conquered power, even though you live in a democratic system. So this led to two things. And you see this in the New Testament. They didn't suppress any local deity, whatever city or whatever town they took over. They never said, okay, remove that. They allowed that worship to continue and their worship system to continue. So you see it in the Hebrews, the Jewish, they allowed them to carry on. And what they did was, in order to kind of cope with this lack of kingship issue that they have, they appointed divine kings. So you had Herod. So Herod was Hebrew, appointed by Rome as king over the region. That's how it worked, just to give you a little bit of a background. So it is a little bit sort of confusing. And Greek cities, so what's interesting about, let's say, Jerusalem, so we think Jerusalem is a Jewish city, but actually the design of Jerusalem is based off Greek kind of design of how a city should be. The right angle of the roads and things like that. It's quite interesting. The external part of the temple was remodeled to base it to look like a Greek temple. And that was done by King Herod the Great. He might have had a self-esteem issues if he called himself Herod the Great. So the thing to remember is the residents were divided into two classes. You were a citizen with full rights, so you were Greek, you were a citizen, and you had full rights. And if you were a foreigner, you paid taxes to stay in the city. So there was different privileges. And then later on, they brought in a third class, which was your slaves. So Herod the Great remodeled Jerusalem according to a Greek system. I've got Glenn sitting there, and he's been there, and I don't know. This is what this guy's telling me, so this is what I'm hearing about Jerusalem. So it actually looked like, if you were a Greek visitor who came to Jerusalem, it looked like a typical Greek city on the outside. All these factors inflamed within the Jewish sect, inflamed Jewish messianic expectation. Remember, there was 400 years of silence from God in terms of there was no prophetic words, there was nothing that was coming through. And this was now towards the end of this silence. King Herod was a horrible guy. He wasn't a great king. So he kind of sided with the Romans, even though he was Jewish. And Luke 3 defines kind of what the feelings were at the time. They said, now, and now, while the people were in a state of expectation, remember it's building because of everything that's going on, all were wondering in their hearts about John. This is John the Baptist, as to whether he was the Christ. So they were wondering, could he be the Messiah? So there was a lot of speculation in the air about the Messiah. There was a lot of speculation about who the Messiah was and what he would come and bring and change as the Messiah. So it starts to build. There were 14 other Messiahs in the area from about 40 BC to about 150, and I'll bring up the timeline now. There were quite a few guys who claimed to be the Messiah, including Jesus. They all came from humble beginnings, so either shepherds or slaves. There was an ex-slave of Herod. They all set themselves up to be kings. Some of them even crowned themselves. And they all had following, like a following of dissident disciples. Must have been an incredibly confusing time, because we have the privilege of looking back through the lens of Christ and going, it's easy. Jesus is the Messiah, right? They had the problem of looking through the lens of the Old Testament, and everything was hidden and veiled and hinted at and alluded at, but not clear about who the Messiah is and what he will do. So Josephus, who was a Jewish historian of the time, he mentions these guys, and all of them, except for Jesus and John the Baptist, brought in violent revolutions or revolts against the kind of the Roman Empire at the time. There were a lot of them that were killed. In fact, most of them were killed. And it was either through crucifixion or being beheaded. One or two were cowards and ran away and allowed their disciples to get killed. So here's the list. You got Hezekiah. This is in 47 BC, so before AD. I had to wrap my head around the timeline to get this right. Then we had Judas, the son of Hezekiah, that guy's son. He led a revolt in Galilee. He had Simon. He was an ex-slave of Herod. There was some guy called a shepherd who I can't pronounce his name. He tried to claim the throne. So when King Herod died, which was about 4 BC, around there, or just after that, quite a few guys tried to take over that kingship, his role. Jesus was born in around, I think, between 4 to 6 BC, or 6 to 4 BC, around there. John the Baptist was beheaded. Jesus was crucified. Then you had all these other uprisings. One guy, it's the Egyptian revolts, the 4,000 dagger men. These guys were crazy. They would hide daggers in their coats and then go into crowded places and then kill people. I think these guys, so there was a lot of people who were killed at the time by these guys, but then there were also a lot of these guys killed. I think one of them, the Roman army caught them in the wilderness and then just killed the lot of them. And you're talking 3,000 followers, 6,000 followers, 4,000 followers. There was a lot of people killed at the time. So you've got all these revolts, all this uprising, all this kind of confusion and fear and wondering and hoping and what is going on. And Jesus gets born into the middle of this scenario. He started in this public arena. So he knew when he was a baby, he knew that King Herod had killed and he had escaped to Egypt. And because of him killing all the baby boys under the age of 2, he knew about this guy, Simon, the ex-slave of King Herod, who led a revolt, and Hezekiah's son. And he knew all about this. So all of this was here. But the difference between him and all those other guys, he and John the Baptist, was that they never participated, joined with, or identified with any of this violence. So that's your difference, right? We should hope, right? But the Jewish leaders of the day were looking at Jesus going, who the heck are you, dude? First of all, he's young. Most of the rabbis were older. He was also, they kind of saw him as a self-appointed rabbi who was trying to get people to follow him. So if you remember, Jesus goes around to all his disciples, come, follow me. That was never done in the day. They never called up people to follow them. The followers would choose who they would go and appoint as their rabbi. That was how it was run. Jesus turned everything on its head. Even with that, if you want to read more about that, go read Alexander's The Real Jesus book. He kind of unpacks that well. So we've got this very volatile, confusing time for the Jewish people. We've got Roman influence and oppression building and building and building. There's lots of bloodshed. There's lots of kind of emotions that are just kind of boiling. It's a big boiling pot of stuff. Now the crucifixion was more common than what we think. So we think the crucifixion, the 3 crosses on the hill, and that's kind of like our understanding or context of the crucifixion. But in fact, for the Romans, they used it as a very common way of trying to keep the public in order. It was very common. It was always pretty much inflicted on the kind of the lower class citizens, not your elite citizens. They had other special ways of dealing with those people. That kind of saw it as if you sacrifice your criminal to the gods of the underworld with the idea of a human sacrifice, kind of remember they weren't that religious, they kind of absorbed religion, but there was that idea that was in there, which is interesting because what Jesus did in terms of the gods of the underworld, and if you unpack Michael Heiss's stuff, you're like, oh, this is interesting. It was actually used as a means of waging war and controlling people. So this is ironic, it helped secure peace in the regions. So every city would have crosses, and they would crucify guys on them. And they did them different ways, and depending on who was the guy who was in leadership, depending on how cruel they would be in how they would crucify someone. It helped weigh down the rebellious people in the rebellious cities. It helped break the will of those conquered people that they were now in charge of. And it helped to be a deterrent to Roman slaves, if you're going to run away, and obviously to all lawbreakers and those who are rebellious and revolutionists. So that was used in terms of the crucifixion by the Romans. For the Jews, when they saw the crucifixion, it was totally scandalous that Jesus, a Jew, would be crucified. and that he would be considered a Messiah. For them, they couldn't get their head around it. He should have demonstrated his divinity by transporting himself away if he was a divine king, either at the time of his capture or even on the cross. In fact, I think most of them expected him, if they thought maybe he was the Messiah, they saw him being crucified, they expected him to disappear off the cross. They never expected him to die on the cross. And they saw it through the lens of that the crucifixion was, if somebody was crucified, it was a lens of somebody who betrayed their own people to a foreign enemy. So Jesus subjected himself to the utmost dishonor by allowing himself to be crucified by Romans. Therefore, that's why they struggled to accept Jesus as a crucified Messiah. And to come up with the idea, to think that God accepted the death in the form of a crucified Jewish manual worker, really, from Galilee, another insult, to break the power of sin and death and bring salvation to all of humanity, they thought was madness. So there was a lot going down. N.T. Wright writes this. He says the Messiah was supposed to win a decisive victory over the pagans, or to rebuild or cleanse the temple. So remember, the temple had been remodeled on the outside to look like a pagan temple. Inside was untouched, but the outside looked like a pagan temple. And in some way or another, bring true God-given justice and peace to the whole world. In other words, he should have come in and changed their world there in, like now, and bring justice to them as a people. What nobody expected was the Messiah to do was to die at the hands of the pagans instead of defeating them. To mount a symbolic attack on the temple, warning it of imminent judgment. Remember, just before he enters the city, he turns over tables and he judges inside the temple what they were doing in terms of that you made my house a den of robbers instead of a house of prayer. Instead of rebuilding or cleansing the temple, and to suffer unjust violence at the hands of pagans instead of bringing them justice and peace. This is what his disciples must have felt as well at the time of the crucifixion. The crucifixion of Jesus, understood from the point of view that of any onlooker, whether sympathetic or not, was bound to have appeared as if the complete destruction of any messianic pretensions or possibilities of he or his followers might have hinted at. So in other words, when Jesus died, they thought, this guy was just a pretender. The violent execution of a would-be Messiah did not say to any Jewish onlooker that he was really the Messiah after all, or that Yahweh's kingdom had come through his work. It said powerfully and irresistibly that he wasn't and that it hadn't. In other words, their hope died for any kind of messianic rescue when Jesus died. You see, Jesus was an unexpected Messiah. He didn't behave like any other Messiah. They were violent. He wasn't. He insulted them by his interpretation of Scripture. He didn't call people to a violent military means of vindication. He claimed to be the Lord of the Sabbath. His first kind of interaction, he was in the temple when he was 12 and all that, but he goes into the temple on a Sabbath and he sits down and he reads Isaiah, I think it's 61, I'll bring it up, and then claims, I am he. He wasn't offering a political kingdom or a religious alternative. He was bringing the whole storyline of scriptures into fulfillment, and they didn't understand that. He proclaimed the kingdom of God was here, but it didn't look like what they thought it would. It was his way of proclaiming the kingdom of God was saying that there was a restoration of creation. But they didn't understand because it didn't look like what they thought. He was saying that we had now constant communication with God. And they were going, well, does that mean that we do away with sacrifices? And Jesus was going, yes. And they didn't understand that. He was ushering in a new age of peace and rest, but it didn't look like what they thought that looked like. He was releasing humanity from bondage, cosmic sin, and death, freedom from debt, slavery, poverty, and oppression, but it didn't look like how they wanted it to look. You see, the Lord of the Sabbath, so he wasn't so concerned of the practice of the Sabbath. He was more concerned of the concept of the Sabbath. So he started his ministry, like I said, in Mark 1. I think I missed out a letter there. I think it's Mark 17. He started his ministry on a Sabbath, which was scandalous. You don't work on the Sabbath. You rest, you stop, you cease on the Sabbath. Reading from Isaiah 61, like I said, he claimed to be the ultimate Sabbath. Can you imagine the offense of the religious leaders of the time, the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the whatnot-sees? And then he called himself the Lord of the Sabbath. He was going around insulting not only the Romans, but the Jewish guys, the Gentiles. He was insulting everyone. No one knew what was going on. He claimed to bring God's mission and to be God. And all of this led up to his cosmic confrontation with the powers of sin and death. Of darkness and evil, right? And then he died. Not only did he die, but he died a shameful death of a slave in a public arena on a Roman cross. So why was he bringing up this? Why was he talking about the Sabbath? Why? If you look at and go back and read the Gospels, you see how much of a theme the Sabbath comes into. And this is where it gets interesting. So what is the Sabbath? What does that mean? We talk about this Sabbath. The Jewish calendar is a beautiful rhythm of weekly Sabbathing, Shabbat. They have their annual festivals. There's a rhythm to the Jewish calendar that we have lost out on. So, Sabbath starts in page 1, Genesis. Glenn, you here, you can read some Hebrew for me. Okay. Nice. So we all know in creation, so we're going back to Genesis. Let's hop back. Genesis 1. There were how many days of creation? Right. And God rested on the? Okay, I was like, my notes have gone. A temple is dedicated in how many days? 7 days. 7 has the meaning of completeness, wholeness, and it's all linked to creation. All right. The design patterns in Genesis are amazing, but there's more. So when you see God separates, he takes light out of darkness. He's leading out of chaos and disorder, the sea, the deep waters. He's pulling out order. He's pulling out peace. He's pulling out light. Okay, so he separates light from darkness. He separates the land and the sea. All of these are rhythms of the Sabbath. And the word Sabbath in Hebrew means to stop or cease from. So God rested. He Sabbathed on the 7th day. Right, okay, so bear with me. First sentence in the book of the Bible is, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Genesis 1:1. Okay, Glenn, this is going to be your turn to, all right, so this, in the Hebrew, so those are about, 10 words. The Hebrew, guess how many words there are in the first sentence?
Did you hear that? Bereshet bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz.
That's what he said. The first sentence in the Hebrew Bible has 7 words. Do you think there's a plan here? Guess what? Hebrews 1:2 has how many words? Hebrew words. 14. 7 times 2. There's a pattern. I didn't put that in because I thought anyway, it's exciting. I think it's great. So, 7 is a beautiful, symmetrical, it's an odd number, but it brings symmetry, right? So you've got 3 and 3, and then 4's in the middle, and it balances it out. So that little word, it, I don't know how you pronounce it, is in the middle. So what have we learned from the Revelation series and all that? If something's in the middle, it's important. Yeah, it's a chiasm. So if you pop it on its side, you get a little arrow, and the middle point is becoming your important thing. It's interesting, Elohim is not in the center. So it's this little word, it. What does it mean? It's 2 words, or 2 letters, Alf and Tav. Guess what those are? The first and the last letter in the Hebrew alphabet. What does that remind you of? Revelation. When Jesus comes into John, and what does he say? I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and last Greek letters. First book in the Bible, Jesus, first and the last. Last book of the Bible, Jesus, first and last. So there you go. All right, so like I said, in the Hebrew calendar, cycles of life are important. So the important days are day 1 of creation, day 4 of creation, and day 6. Why do you say day 6? Well, that's what it is. These all are dealing with different aspects of time. Okay, so time. Now remember, we're talking about Sabbath. What do we do on a Sabbath? We rest. What does that mean? We come to God and we go, you know what, I'm not in charge of time. You are. So I rest and I give time over back to you. I give my autonomy. I give my being in charge. I give my work. I give my all, and I understand that I come under and I surrender to God, who is in charge of time, of my work, of all. And I lean into him. That is to Sabbath. But this is also a linear journey. I don't know if you remember, Jewish understanding of time is linear, whereas Greek and other understanding of time is, Alexander taught us at the Kingdom Conference, that it's kind of the circular thing. So remember, it's linear. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? You can't skip. And you now have proof I can count to 7. So it's about a journey. The creation story is building day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, building on each other to get to day 7. There's a point to it. It's building to the completeness of 7 when God rested. And we were supposed to rest with him in his temple, ruling and reigning. So that's the thing. All right, so Jesus is the man in the middle, as Alistair Begg says. He's right in the beginning of the first sentence in the book of Hebrews Bible, Genesis 1:1. So now I'm going to take you to a story. I'm trying to tie this up. I'm taking you to the story of Elijah. So Elijah was this poor guy. If you read his story, like onwards, it's like an epic tale of like highs and lows. And oh my gosh, this guy, I relate to him so much because he responds just like a normal human. So this little story is just after the fact that, so he'd taken on all the Baal's prophets. I don't know if you recall the story. I think it's in Kings 17, where he takes on Baal's prophets. And it's a massive, mind-blowing, kind of epic sideswipe of the enemy. He creates an altar, they create their altar. And then he says, okay, guys, you do your thing. And they cut themselves, they try and burn fires, they do everything. It takes a huge amount of time, sweating and a whole lot of drama to try and get their God to show up. Nothing happens. And then you get Elijah, he pours water onto the altar. He drenches the thing. And then he prays to God and fire comes down from heaven. Oof. Epic showdown. Guess who loses and guess who wins? And then he goes to those prophets. They hunt them down. I think there were 200 of them or whatever. And they kill them, execute all of them. I think he won. But the first thing he does is he doesn't go so he's killed all these prophets. He doesn't go and join the party because everybody's like, oh my gosh, this is the Lord, this is the Creator, and they start worshiping him on the floor. But Elijah doesn't do that. So he tells Ahab, this is just before, he says, go eat and drink, which is an interesting concept. And then Elijah climbs to the top of Mount Carmel. And he bends towards the ground. So another context over thing is the country's been in a drought, 3-year drought. All right, so remember that. Elijah's like, to start this thing off, God says to Elijah, you're gonna need to pray for rain now. Kills the prophets. Now we've got this scenario. So he bends down towards the ground, puts his face between his knees, and he told his servant, go up and look in the direction of the sea. Okay, so when you hear sea, what do you think? Not the beach, guys. When you hear the sea in the Bible, what do you think of? Chaos, disorder, the enemy of God. Okay. Keep that in mind. So he went and looked and reported there's nothing. Interesting, because didn't those guys just lose a big battle? Okay, so he comes. How many times does Elijah tell his servants? Now, Elijah doesn't get up and go, hey, hang on. Let me look for myself. No. He stays on his knees with his head down. Look, I don't know how he get his head in between his knees, but he's on the ground, face on the ground. The 7th time, the servant comes back and he says, there's a small cloud. Okay, so when you hear small cloud in the Bible, what do you think of? Clouds. I'm thinking, okay, if it's like a fist, so it's a tiny little man's fist, so maybe one of those little clouds outside, just all on its own, over the sea. All right, so now we've got some languaging here that's interesting. Cloud, Daniel 7. Who comes on riding on the clouds? Son of Man. So we've got now imagery. We've got the sea, chaos, disorder. 7 times he comes back, he reports there's a cloud over the sea. God is doing something over chaos and disorder, and he's bringing in order. The minute Elijah hears that there's a tiny little cloud, he's like, it's done. That's faith. He's going, cool, let's get going. So what does he do? He kind of comes down, he tells Ahab, hitch up the chariots, go down so the rain won't overtake you. It's a small cloud over the ocean, and he's like acting as if a deluge is coming. That's what we do in faith. He rode towards, meanwhile, So now the sky is building. The sky was covered with dark clouds. The wind blew, and there was a heavy rainstorm. So this makes me think, okay, what is this linking to? Because remember all the hyperlinks that the Bible does. Remember that one image, right? So I was saying to God, why does this story sit with me? And why do you want me to think? But what is it linking to? It's a great question, Louise. Guess what? Matthew 17, 6 days later. So we prick up our ears, 6 days. Creation, 6 days. And then there was 7. So something about timing of an era that Jesus is telling us about this. 6 days later, Jesus took him, Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them privately up to a high mountain. So we have another high mountain. We have Jesus. We have day number 6 in here. And he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. Go and read Daniel 7 again. It's taking you back to there. Then Moses and guess who? Elijah also appeared before them, talking with Jesus. How's that? So Peter says to Jesus, we always come up with these great ideas, and God's like okay, dear, all right. We can do it this way. We'll build a temple, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. God's like, okay, all right. Let's just get the bad ideas out the way. His patience with us is great. Yeah. While he was still speaking, so while Peter's still having these brilliant brainwaves, God says, a bright cloud overshadows them. Are we talking clouds now? So now this little fist of a cloud becomes something that overshadows them. And a voice from the cloud says, this is my one dear son, in whom I take great delight. Similar wording to what was after when Jesus was baptized, but he adds on something. He says, listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they were overwhelmed with fear, and they threw themselves with their faces to the ground. But Jesus came, touched them, and said, get up, do not be afraid. You see, when we interact with Jesus in a way that puts him, and we understand that when we experience him, our response can be one of fear. Or our response can be like Elijah, I won't look until I know that it's him and that he's touched me, and then I get up. And when they looked, they saw Jesus alone. We can have so many things. So where do we place our hope? The funny story with Elijah is in that moment, he responded in faith and he knew. The very next sentence tells us how he became afraid because of Jezebel and he ran in fear of his life. God knows that, and that's okay. We don't have to have perfect faith all the time. But when we encounter him, he asks us to meet him. When the disciples had a sneak preview of the transfiguration, they got a glimpse into the resurrected Jesus. But you see, we have to go through the linear journey of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to reach completeness in 7. So we are living where we have a Messiah of the already but not yet, of the kingdom that is within us that is already but not yet. We have him in us. He is resurrected and he resides and abides in us. But we live in a world that lives in the 6, the not yet. And sometimes, occasionally, we get to experience the already, where he comes down. But sometimes we live in the, like Elijah, where we respond in faith and sometimes we don't. The hope is we're getting to day 7, the completeness, the fullness of a recreation, of the renewing and restoration of day 7. But we live in a posture of ultimate surrender. So to Sabbath means I let go of my concept, my autonomy. I let go of my control, which is actually an illusion. I let go of me, and I hold on to, because I know his kingdom is coming, but it's coming in through and with me. So I get to tell others about that. So the important thing is, it's not about the crucifixion, although it was amazing, and we wouldn't have the resurrection without the crucifixion. The important thing is the it in the middle, the man in the middle, and how do we respond to him?